species of native orchids, glacial bogs, old growth forests. And I have to say that this remembrance of my childhood island brought a tear to my eye because the island where I grew up is Manhattan, and I had no clue. I think as a kid growing up in the city, I never even really thought about like what the prior, I mean, for one thing, I didn't grow up with like a nature connection or anything, but I definitely didn't think about, what was the prior ecological, makeup of the island or anything. And one of the things that the book said, or talked about, was just the incredible diversity of what is now Manhattan Island and its sort of situation between north and south, and river and sea and land. And the biodiversity of Manhattan rivaled that of some of our, sort of most celebrated national parks. And as a city kid turned nature person later in life, the whole thing was sort of shocking and upsetting and also revelatory for me. I think a lot of us who are interested in the natural world, we have a tendency to look to the past with sadness and with sort of a yearning because I think we have a sense that of how beautiful it must have been before people messed it up. But as we know, before people mess it up, maybe is our notion of, before European arrival, perhaps. And there were people before that too. And that reality, I think, is slowly infiltrating our ecological thinking. But there are a lot of books about nature and ecology, a lot of considerations of native plants and their distribution and everything else that don't really take into account the human element or the human participation in what we think of as a natural or ecological landscape. I think conventional views that many of us learned in school or what have you are that there were small scattered bands of indigenous peoples across the continent, and now there's so much more information revealing just how densely populated the Americas were, including our portion of North America. So, you know, this image that you're seeing on the screen here, it's an artist rendering of what's now Wall Street. And I love it because it's sort of shocking to think that that's Wall Street. I went to high school, like, I don't know, half mile away or something. And it definitely didn't look anything even remotely like this. And of course, on the one hand, this picture sort of shows that natural beauty that the book Mannahatta talks about, the richness of the ecology, and it also like subtly alludes to the human element. You see maybe some like small dwellings with smoke rising from the top. But one thing that this image doesn't do is it doesn't um, really speak to the human involvement in the landscape. And I've become more and more curious about that as I've read really interesting things from other parts of the world. So, on the one hand, fairly close at hand, there's so much information about the prairie, that sort of millions of acre beautiful native wildflower habitat, just to the west of presumably most of us, and information about how it was sort of this incredible partnership between uh, people and fire and buffalo and native plants and all these different elements. And, one of the other places that we've received really interesting information about the sort of interconnectedness of what we think of as culture and ecology is the Amazon. So I think many of us, o- I think many people think of the Amazon as sort of this archetype of like an untouched wilderness, perhaps the archetypal untouched wilderness on the planet. And what's coming out from ecological archaeology and cultural ecology and so on is a landscape that has been heavily shaped by human involvement, um, large populations, forgotten cities, and all this, and also plant composition in many places that reflect human tending or human planting or human dispersal. So As a field botanist, my job is basically to, go to natural areas and make lists of plants. But I don't think that my job is just creating a list of the plant species that I find. I think that my job is to interpret the story of a site by listening to what the plants are communicating by their presence, by their absence, and by their health, and reconciling that with what I understand or can discover about the history of that site. So oftentimes I'm considering fairly recent history. I'm looking at things like stone walls or multi-trunk trees that might indicate recent logging, evidence of mining, things like that. But I'm also conscious that our landscape has changed quite radically in recent millennia and in recent centuries, including um, ebbs and flows and cultural changes within human involvement. And heck, we're not even that far out of the last height of sort of ice age, cold and glaciation here, and megafauna and all these other elements. So as I'm thinking about, why do landscapes look this way, I'm also trying to put together a story of like what happened here. And why is this one spot incredibly rich in plant diversity and this other spot is all degraded and full of invasive plant species and so on? See what I can do here. So as a botanist, it's my job to tell the story of places. And I have to admit, I'm tired of telling the same story of excessive deer browsing, of invasive species. I know that there are plant and animal species missing from the places that I explore and that I work in. And I feel that the animal that is most often missing is actually us. I think we have a tendency, especially within the conservation community, to characterize most human involvement as negative. So, the earth moving machines, they're destroying, clearing another forest. But as we move into an era of ecological restoration, I don't know if the word really got out, but we are happen to be in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. It sort of feels like we're in the decade of a lot of other stuff right now, but um, as we move into an era where ecological restoration is so important and so forefronted, can we tell a story about human involvement that is older, that might be deeper, that looks to other cultures and places and times for an understanding of how we can live differently with the natural world? Because I feel like ecological restoration, we're still figuring it out, right? Restoration is a young art, but land management is an ancient practice on this continent. And furthermore, it was always internet with what I'm going to call cultural plants. So edible, medicinal, craft species, species used for building homes and fiber, for ceremony and so on. So I'm just going to call them cultural plants as a shorthand. And that is at the center of what the rest of this presentation is going to be about. The ways that land management and caretaking of plant communities and the use of those plant communities have been connected for many millennia on this continent and in this region. So I'm just going to start with another book that was really influential to me early on when I was starting out in land stewardship. And my background is in anthropology and history, so I suppose maybe I always gravitated towards these sort of synthetic understandings between culture and ecology. But I have to say that reading this book um, was really eye-opening for me. So this is Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, and it deals not with our local ecology, but the ecology of what is now called California. And what Kat Anderson has done is talked about the ways that most of the plant communities in California were influenced in varying degree by indigenous peoples management. So she talks about, on the one hand, the way that some of the, let's say, European derived observers of California landscapes really treated them, people like John Muir, as like, sort of chapels of God and so on. And definitely didn't perceive them as being constructed by people. And what Kat Anderson says is that, these beautiful extensive prairies and oak landscapes and all these other gorgeous landscapes out on the West Coast were in fact the partnership of people and plants and wildlife. And that people's land management, indigenous people's land management, relied heavily on techniques like coppicing, pruning, harrowing, and especially fire. And so she talks a lot with indigenous people and with source material from her region and kind of reconstructs what tending the wild would look like there. And I would say that a lot of my interest in writing wild plant culture was like, I wish I could write tending the wild for the East Coast. And in a way, I can't. I feel like on the West Coast, because for historical reasons, I think that there's more access to information about indigenous land management than there is out east. Certainly more access than I had. Maybe other people see that or have different access than I did. So coming a little bit closer to home, there's another great book called Notes on a Lost Flute. And this is by Kerry Hardy. He's up in Maine and he kind of follows trails of varying types to gain a better understanding of the Maine landscape and especially indigenous lifeways and how they're related to the landscape. So on the one hand, his trails are physical and visceral, and on the other hand, he spends a lot of time like looking at linguistics and place names and trying to understand what those names mean and how they might relate to like a seasonal calendar of hunting and foraging and so on. And one of the things that Carrie talks about that's so interesting is um, he talks about an Algonquin term called Minnesage. I may be pronouncing that completely wrong, and it basically pertains to tending the land or to a fire maintained landscape and Carey finds remnants of what he presents as a former indigenous maintained landscape. So he finds like copses of American plum or plants like bur oak or Jerusalem artichoke that are putatively out of range but are occupying these interesting places up in Maine and just talks about this food landscape. So you can see kind of the list there: strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, chokecherries, plums, groundnut, wood lily, Canada lily, and so on. It's a fascinating book, and partially because he's starting to bring this ten in the wild idea much closer to home. A third book that might be most familiar to you all, uh, that I also found influential and I think raises some really interesting questions, is the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I imagine some of you have read this book. I found this to be a really beautiful book about plants. And as she weaves the story of this native grass, sweetgrass, which is used for basketry and ceremonial purposes, through her book, one of the things that Robin talks about is uh, the way that she and her graduate students have investigated the disappearance of sweetgrass from the sort of natural or wild landscapes. And one of the things that they find is that the presence of sweetgrass is heavily correlated to the presence of indigenous peoples communities that still utilize sweetgrass. Basically, she he conducts both mapping exercises and experiments and finds that sweetgrass thrives where it is used and disappears elsewhere, which really kind of turns on its head, I think, a lot of um, the sort of inherited wisdom within conservation about what would be best for the natural world, which I think is generally like it would be best for the natural world if humans would just buzz off. Um, and I think that we have these hints, or maybe stronger than hints, from what we know about indigenous land management that suggests that it is quite otherwise, and that many of the signature habitats that have perhaps been disappearing, whether they're savannas in the Midwest or prairies or oak landscapes out in California or different kinds of open landscapes um, out east by me, many of these are actually cultural landscapes. And many of the plant species that we see dwindling um, I'm going to be bold and say that I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are dwindling because they lack human involvement. Even plants that we've had a very deleterious relationship with recently, an extractive relationship. So plants that used to be tended by healers, plants like your golden seals and your ginsengs and so on, that are now heavily extracted from the Appalachians for global trade in medicinal plants, are plants that there is a lot of lore and there's a lot of information about how people would replant and distribute and disperse the seeds of. And now, of course, in my home state of New Jersey, both of those plants are on the state list of threatened and endangered species. So, I think that the takeaway for me from braiding sweetgrass, one of them is that when people leave and we go to occupy our bubbles of technology and conventional agriculture and so on, sweetgrass leaves also. And what other plant species are also disappearing because they are no longer culturally in relationship with us? So y'all might recognize this. I think this is a classic optical illusion. Um, you sort of see maybe two faces on the side in black, or a goblet, chalice, candle holder, I don't know, something ornate in the center. And I would suggest that so much of what we could maybe blanket term Western thought is focused on those two individuals rather than that relationship between them, what we see in white in the center. So much of our science has been about dissecting and categorizing and taxonomizing individual parts. And I think that ecology may be radical within the sciences because it reorients us towards relationships, towards that goblet in the center instead. I want to show you that picture, uh, the same picture, but in sort of in a different way. This is the native plant version of that picture. In this picture, we have cardinal flower and we have hummingbird. And there's some weird animation that's supposed to happen. I don't think it happened. Um, on the one hand, we have cardinal flower with these long red tubular corollas, right? The flowers. And on the other hand, we have hummingbird with her um, long, long bill going all the way deep into the base of one of cardinal flower's flowers and finding a nectar reward there. And I think we can just sort of where's my laser pointer? Hold on. This is always fun, right? Is this a laser pointer? There we go. All right. Great choice of presentation. Oh, it's not really working out. Okay. Well, I think you can see that the way that um, hummingbird and cardinal flower sort of fit perfectly together. And while hummingbird is finding some nectar deep within the flower of cardinal flower, you can also see that cardinal flower's anthers are depositing just a little bit of pollen on the back of hummingbird's head. And, you know, don't get me wrong, cornflower, really beautiful, ruby-throated hummingbird, really beautiful bird, but without each other, like without flowers with long red tubular corollas, hummingbirds are kind of weird, right? Like that long bill and they just hover. I don't know. I have to say, as a city kid, the first time I saw a hummingbird, I was absolutely terrified because I only knew like insects and I just thought it was some humongous flying insect. And I was like up in the Adirondacks and there were a couple of them flying around this boathouse and I didn't want to walk by them on the dock because it's like I just I thought that they were some kind of huge bug. Um, so maybe I have a strange perspective where I can think of hummingbird as weird, but what I would say is that without each other, all of a sudden these adaptations that have evolved together over deep time become sort of meaningless or grotesque. Like why does cardinal flower look so different from like a nice, friendly, normal flower, like like an aster or a dandelion or something? And it's because of hummingbird, and you couldn't have cardinal flower in Europe or Asia because you don't have hummingbirds there. So like lobelias and other um, plant species that have a North American hummingbird adapted version or species, and that same genus in the old world, if you will, they can look quite different because they are addressing different pollinators, and hummingbirds only exist in the Americas. And I guess what I'm driving at here, um, by talking about this relationship between hummingbird and cardinal flowers, that without ecological context, without these deep time relationships, individual species can be kind of weird or monstrous or grotesque. And I think that's what's happened to us. We don't have our relationships anymore, and so we act in weird and monstrous and grotesque ways within the landscape. So I want to talk about foraging a little bit. I want to talk about foraging partially because it's fun, and partially because we're talking about cultural plants, and partially because we're talking about relationship. And I think it gets at some questions. I'm often putting together these presentations because ultimately, even though I'm acting like the expert, it's because I have questions. And one of the questions that I had as a forager is I think we foragers, like, we treasure the connection with the wild that foraging gives us. Oh, I've got my secret spot, or oh, I need to know exactly what time of year is the right time to go to such and such and find this ripe, or get there before the squirrels do, or whatever. And it's kind of it's a little bit of a hunt, it's a little bit of a treasure hunt, and it can be a lot of fun. And and I would say that, we're connecting to plants, and what can we give back? How can we turn that connection into relationship? Because I'm not sure that they're the same thing. In foraging, we go, we learn about the natural world, we come back home with, something really delicious. Um, but where's the reciprocity in that? Because I'm not sure that wild habitats can sustain our human population levels or our bumbling way of dealing with land uh, without some kind of reciprocal exchange. And I think that reciprocity is stewardship. I think it's tending. I think it's tending the wild. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, and many different things intertwined, but I wanted to talk to foragers about ways that we could give back to the wild. Those of us who really enjoy, finding wild foods and treasure the feeling of connection that that gives to us. So I have a little story here, a little note next to the story to keep it short. I'm going to try to do that. So what you have here is common milkweed. I know that we all learned in school or wherever that common milkweed is poisonous and monarch butterflies become poisonous and the birds don't eat them, and that's why they're so colorful. And it's sort of this classic nugget of ecology. And even I learned it as a city kid. But a common milkweed also makes this really interesting edible plant species. And part of the reason it's really interesting edible to me is because it has such a long harvest season, like much longer than most of our garden vegetables, certainly longer than many of our sort of foraged wild edibles. Because common milkweed you can harvest when it's a fresh shoot coming out of ground in early May. And that's sort of like its asparagus phase, right? It hasn't unfurled its leaves yet. It's soft and tender. This is true of many shoot vegetables. They're best in the spring before they've kind of gotten hard and woody or developed, uh, adverse secondary toxins and so on. And then there's the unopened flower phase, which if the shoot phase is the broccoli phase, I like to think, excuse me, the asparagus phase. I like to think of this as the broccoli phase. And that's what you see in the center in the mason jar there. I made some lacto fermented milkweed top pickles, and we'll get back to that, right? Um, After those flowers turn into the warty seed pods, but before the kind of like floaty wishies inside them become floaty wishies, those seed pods are soft, and that's kind of like the okra phase, right? Because okra, you can't eat it once like the seeds are hard and that seed pod has hardened as well, but it's good when it's young and tender, as long as you cook it for a really long time. Um, and I will say for anybody who's listening to this and is like, well, milkweed is poisonous. Yeah, by all means, reach your own comfort level with how to prepare it first, before you try it. But I would also submit that many of our foods, we know how to prepare them, and that's what turns something inedible to something edible. Like, if I handed you a raw potato and you'd never seen a potato before, and I was like, 50% of the world subsists primarily on this or whatever it is, and you bit into that raw potato, you'd be really cross at me because it's not really edible, but we know how to make French fries and tater tots and mashed potatoes and all kinds of good stuff out of potatoes. So this is true of many native plants as well. In a way, we need to develop a culture around how do we make milkweed safe to eat and tasty. So some years back, I made these lacto fermented milkweed pickles. I think I was interested in wild fermentation, and the upshot is I was like really proud of myself. And I guess this shows how long ago it was, but I put it up on Facebook. Uh, and I was really proud of myself, patting myself on the back. And then somebody within my naturalist community was like, well, I prefer to leave my milkweed for the monarchs. And I was like, oh, ouch. I was just trying to show off. And so ever since then, I've been integrating this into all my presentations so I can talk about why I'm right and why she was wrong. And the reason that I feel that I'm correct and that she's wrong is that if all of us who plant kale or tomatoes or basil or even, you know, lavender or rosemary, all these great classic garden plants, if we also planted common milkweed, I'm pretty sure there would be more for us and more for the monarchs. And not only that, monarchs are these glorious creatures that like we barely see, right? I see them in fall migration and they kind of like flit in from one side of the screen and fly off the other. And I try to catch a photo really quick, while they go land on a New England aster or something like that. And I'm sort of like, and these are just like astonishing looking creatures. And if we plant milkweed and monarch eats the milkweed, and we also eat the milkweed. We're breaking bread with the monarchs, right? We've forged a new connection with this beautiful wild creature that before we didn't share that connection with. So to me, that's meaningful. To me, that's I think ultimately more meaningful than trying to catch that photograph while they're on the New England aster. Although photographs of butterflies are great. So let's get into the meat and potatoes here. Um, we have vast areas of land that could support more intact relationships, right? And we've got our lawns, we have urban areas. Don't get me started on farms. There's many parks and nature preserves that could use restoration, that could be repaired in various ways. And then there's all of our stream and riversides, so degraded, sometimes so depressing, but with so much potential. So we have vast areas of land that could support more intact relationships, and I believe that we can do so using more intact habitats as the model. And so I'd like to talk about, next slide, an idea from ecological restoration that really speaks to me. And it's this idea of the reference ecosystem, or sometimes it's called a reference community. What have you, but it's an idea promulgated by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is a very admirable organization championing restoration standards worldwide, and is a great community of restoration practitioners. And so this is their definition. To me, a reference ecosystem is the place where we go to observe a version of the land that we are trying to restore or repair, to observe a version of it that is in some way more intact or more diverse, or said in the way that we've been talking about during this presentation, has more relationships, right? Has more intact relationships. And I think that the idea of a reference ecosystem or reference community really speaks to me, partially because I think it speaks to the deep-seated creativity that we have as human beings. So, sure, we can go to reference ecosystem and we can do a lot of monitoring plots and we can come home with spreadsheets full of data. Um, and to a certain extent we can translate that data from a spreadsheet back to our restoration landscape. But I also believe that we can go as observers, and that one of the things that we do really well as human beings is observe and then copy, right? This is our learning process. To be able to see something and mimic it, as a I'm gonna go out on a limb and give an example that I haven't talked about in a while, but one of the things that I find really astonishing is, um, and maybe some of you have practiced this, but is tracking. The ways that people can interpret uh, the trails and even bearish traces of wildlife moving through the landscape and construct whole stories of like when this happened, what happened, where the wildlife went. And of course, as human beings hunting in wild landscapes, this was an incredibly well developed skill. And I think it really spoke to our mimetic capacity, our ability to imitate, because part of tracking is really it's becoming the animal. It's thinking like, okay, the animal is here, and then I lose track of them briefly. Which way would I go if I was that animal, and really trying to inhabit like their gait and their movement and their posture. And I think you still see things like this in our different movement arts and in our martial arts and so on, where we can embody each other or other movements or abstractions or for that matter, like different animals. And so I think one of the things that creative humans are really good at is this type of mimicry. And I believe that as restoration practitioners, we also have access to this, so that in a way we're going to these reference ecosystems and absorbing as much as we can from them. Like, you know, later in the day, which way does the sun shine through the canopy, or how does wind move through the landscape, or what portion of this habitat has the most grasses and sedges, and why might that be? Or, where is the shrub understory thickest, or where are the trees widest space? And ultimately, like all that information that we're absorbing in the wild landscape as keen observers is very hard to translate over to spreadsheets and then back. And so I like the sort of artistry within this concept. And as a nonfiction writer, when I go to bookstores and I see shelves and shelves of fiction, and I know that in each of these books, there's this incredible evocation of like what it means to be human and human emotions and conversations and stuff, but none of this actually happened. It just kind of puts me in awe of one, those authors, but two, like our human ability to recreate life in such realistic ways. And isn't that what we're doing as gardeners and as restoration practitioners? We're recreating life. So I think that as gardeners, um, I think that the idea of gardening is changing under the tutelage of native plant gardeners like us, right? Because we're starting to think about gardens as long-lasting restorations on the scale of like our backyard or the schoolyard, and we're starting to think about considering the habitat that we're planting into and utilizing appropriate plants for that specific place. And so place becomes a window into soils and geology and wildlife partners and all these things, because those are the things that are going to help our restoration thrive and persist in the long term in a way that's very different from like a small tended annual garden or something like that. I don't know, I'm a laser pointer still. Right. So we're talking a lot about intact native habitats. What does a intact native habitat look like? And also, if we're talking about cultural plant species, what food plants does it contain? I want to take you to Dyeberry Creek, Pennsylvania. This is in the Endless Mountains, and it's in my presentation just because it's a place we went on like a family reunion trip some years ago. And when I travel, I tend to have in the back of my head like, what cool plants am I going to see here? And maybe like a little wish list. Like we go out west, and I'm like, oh, I really want to see like California poppies and wild lupines, and I want to see Indian paintbrush. And when we went to Dyeberry Creek, I had this notion that I really wanted to see bee balm, Monarda didyma, because here in Jersey, we do have bee balm, but it's considered by the state to be endangered, and at least like natural occurrences of it only exist in like the far northwestern corner of the state. more or less. It is naturalized and so on. But I was really curious because I wanted to know, like, we grow bee balm in our nursery. Who does it like to hang out with? Where does it? It looks like a meadow plant, but it doesn't like hanging out with wild bergamot in like the dry meadow with with little blue stem or something like that. So what is this beautiful creature? So, I knew that we were going to a part of PA where there was some bee balm, and I really wanted to find it. And what I ended up finding was this beautiful creek with very rich sun and shade communities. So along the margins of the creek, where it was sunny, there was Joe Pye weed and tall coneflower and boneset and cardinal flower and all these sort of showy sunny forbs. And just in from there was like, stuff like spice bush on the edge and elderberry and wild yam root twining around and also bee balm. So super excited. And even more excited when I walked into the woods, the shaded woods on the edge, and found blue cohosh and trilliums and this beautiful um, ragged fringe, purple fringed orchid. So like a really rich habitat. I would say like a good reference community for me coming from fairly developed central New Jersey, where many of our stream sides are, mugwort and Japanese knotweed and stiltgrass and so on. So I made a little list while I was there. This is by no means a comprehensive botanical survey. I just wanted to figured I'd write about bee balm and I wanted to take some notes about who was hanging out nearby. And you can see this is like a pretty great plant list. There's some non-native species in there. There's some really top-notch, sort of niche adapted, conservative, native plant species, your foam flowers and purple trilliums, and hemlocks, and so on. And I want to talk through some of the plants that I found there. So this is just like a cherry-picked list of some of my favorite edible and medicinal plant species from this prior list here. It is in fact not everything edible from here. It's just some goodies, edible and medicinal. So on the one hand, we have Uh, I'm going to respect our time limit and not go deep into any of these, but quick scan. We have ramps, wild leeks, which are now sort of like a gourmet item. Gourmet wild onion. We've got milkweed, which we talked about, yellow birch, which makes a delicious tea, one of my favorite wild teas, and can also be used as a toothbrush. It already has wintergreen and xylitol in it, so if you buy health food store toothpaste, you've got two of your ingredients checked off there right away. Blue cohosh, which is a medicinal plant used largely in birthing. Boneset, which is used for intermittent flu-like symptoms, intermittent fevers. Virginia waterleaf, a cooked green, wood nettle, maybe my favorite cooked green in the whole wide world. You have to cook it to deactivate the stinging hairs, which it shares with its relative stinging nettle. But it's so rich, it's kind of like seaweed of the land. Very high in minerals and protein and so on. Ostrich fern, which is the cooked fern fiddlehead. Um, Bee balm, which makes a really delicious, soothing tea, hence the balm. And also, if you like to pretend that you're a hummingbird, this is another plant with long red tubular florets, so guess who pollinates it? Um, and it has a sweet nectar reward at the base of all those florets. And the florets have a taste sort of like an aroma of rose and citrus and a sweetness and a little bit of oregano. They make a great like garnish for salads, or you can just go and top on the top of the flowers. Um, Tall flower, earliest cooked green of the season, another really excellent one cooked up in a skillet. Elderberry, basswood, which is edible, has edible leaves for about a week while they're still really tender. Hemlock, not Socrates' hemlock, but our eastern hemlock, which has a tea that reminds me of the North Woods. And then great nettle, which is our native subspecies of stinging nettle. So, hey, for a little plant list just off the cuff on a creekside, that's a lot of food there and a fair amount of medicine also. So if we were to go to a place like Dyeberry Creek, or some other riparian area, a stream, a river, with the intent of maybe harvesting or tending or cultivating food there. Um, and we see ourselves in relationship to this habitat. What can we offer back? So, for starters, so many of our bottomland habitats are so heavily disturbed by agricultural conversion, by hydrological changes due to colonial era damming, and by industry that often thrived off of those riverside dams and mills and so on. And these areas are ripe for restoration. And I would say that so much of what we can do that is beneficial maintenance for riparian areas actually takes place upstream. So while we can certainly go and we can sprinkle fresh wild leek seeds where all the market foragers depleted them for some high-end restaurant, and we can definitely always go and hunt more deer to bring their population into balance because their predators or their non-human predators are missing. One of the things that we can do that is really beneficial to streams and rivers is simply how we handle water upstream. So I think we are in a society that tends to handle water like garbage to be gotten rid of from the landscape as rapidly as possible. And so we have gutters on our roofs and gutters in the landscape and everything channeling down and off of roads into streams and wetlands and ultimately, into rivers and out to sea. And ideally, as rapidly as possible, getting it off of yards and streets and roads. And the problem with this, of course, is that in any kind of rain event, especially the really significant rain events that we've been having, you have really flashy flooding that is intensely disturbing to streams and rivers, can really incise the banks. So I've, been lucky enough to once in a while work in areas that have stream headwaters where they haven't been incised by nearby development. And the sort of shocking thing for me in some of these landscapes is that streams aren't actually these things deeply set into the landscape in gouges like the River Danube running through to Budapest or something. They are at the level of the land around them, and the land around them is often sort of spongy and hydrated and aerated and suffused with both water and oxygen and incredible plant diversity. And when streams become incised deep below their floodplains, you just have these sort of upland floodplains that are degraded, they don't have wetlands plants in them anymore, and they're just subject to occasionally really flashy flooding when we have like a crazy rain event. And the streams, meanwhile, get cut deeper and deeper into landscape and sundered further and further from all the plants that need that water, right? So one of the things that we are all doing for rivers and streams is being gardeners, right? Any landscape that could have been impervious landscape or lawn that we are planting with native plants and planting with gardens in general are much more apt to absorb and infiltrate water in place where it falls from rain rather than to send it as runoff into our local waterways. So, lest we think that it's only in these fertile bottomlands that we have wonderful edible and medicinal plant species, I'm going to take us to sort of like the polar opposite, at least within the New Jersey landscape where I work, to Pyramid Mountain. So, Pyramid Mountain is a Morris County park in New Jersey, and it's a place that I did botanical survey work back in 2016 or so. Um, and it's one of my favorite places that I've done surveys. And one of the reasons is because it had this extensive network of glacially scoured ridge lines. So these are ridges of resistant billion-year-old felsic rocks. So high in feldspar and silica, your gneisses and your granites and your related rock types. And during the last glaciation, they basically had like their tops shaved off by the glaciers. So no topsoil anymore, lots of exposed bedrock. And there's these really unique plant communities up there growing in the very thin, poor soils and the cracks in between the bedrock. The picture that you're looking at now, you could actually look from that ridge and see downtown New York. So that's just to geographically situate everybody a little bit. But, beautiful 2,000 acre park, a lot of diversity there and a little window into that outcropping area that you could see downtown Manhattan from. Uh, Here's some of the species. Again, just like a little list. This is by no means the comprehensive botanical survey for Pyramid Mountain. It's just like that spot. And we've got some really cool native plants and some really beautiful native plants. Here's the plant list real quick, and then here's some of the edible and medicinal plant species there. Um, and I'd say that like if those bottomlands, those stream corridors, they're kind of like the breadbasket. There's all kinds of good starches and tubers and shoots and so on. I tend to think of our uplands and our glades and our hilltops and so on as like maybe the trail mix because this is an area that's so rich in fruits and nuts. And I'd say it's partially the reason why. Well, you know what? We'll get to the reason why. Let's talk about some of the fruits and nuts and so on up there first. So we have downy serviceberry, which I think that serviceberry is probably the best fruit that you can buy in a market. It's, it's about the size and shape of a blueberry, but it's in the rose family, so it has sort of like cherry almond overtones. It's a little aptly, but it's very unique and very, very delicious. Like Rachel and I once went and we foraged some service berries, and Rachel was like, "These are as good as cherries." I was like, "That is about as high of a compliment for a fruit as you can give in my book." On maybe the other end of the spectrum, you have chokeberry, which is not super good fresh. It's very astringent, but it makes a great juice, and it's one of these like super foods, extremely high in antioxidants and vitamins and so on. Yeah, black birch, very cognate to yellow birch in the lowlands. Um, Black huckleberry, which if you like blueberries, you'll love huckleberries. I think I like them even more. And when you're foraging up on one of those, hilltops or ridge lines, often you'll see both lowbush blueberry and black huckleberry intermingled and might not even differentiate. But huckleberry is, to me, it's like a little less sour and it has this little seedy crunch to it, which maybe that doesn't sound appealing, but they're totally delicious. Dewberries aren't always that awesome, but when they're grown on a rock outcropping that gets like 125 degrees in the August sun, they can be really sweet and amazing, and they're super good up at Pyramid Mountain. Lowbush blueberry, Indian cucumber root is a native root that actually tastes like cucumber. In the interest of time, I won't say much more about it. Solomon seal. So we talked earlier about how milkweed has this asparagus phase. And Solomon seals do too. So when the leaves are still clasped up at the top and they haven't opened up the shoot, at least on the native Solomon seals, so your polygonatum pubescens and biflorum, those make really good asparagus-like cooked shoots. And I would say like asparagus without the asparagus, they don't have that weird kind of funky taste odor afterwards. Super sweet and tender. And the Solomon seal up on these glades is Polygonum biflorum, variety biflorum. They're kind of like segmented in terms of what habitats they occupy. Black cherry, if you like black cherry soda, um, tasty fruits. Sassafras, if you like root beer. That's from the roots of sassafras. If you ever dig one up, it's like, oh my God, I just dug up root beer. Black haw viburnum, one of the last edible native fruits of the season, and oaks. Just want to talk about oaks for a second here. We live in a culture and we live in a, how to say this? The civilization we live in is in like a long trajectory of civilizations and cultures that have subsisted with like the base of our food pyramid being annual grains. So we consume a lot of, and to some extent, legumes, but uh, wheat and corn and so on. And in fact, large portions of the most fertile parts of our country are now converted to things like growing annuals like corn. And there are other cultures in the world that used oaks and acorns similarly to how we use, say, wheat or corn as these fundamental starches in our diets. And I like to imagine how much more ecologically healthy the world would be if we could rely on like centuries old trees and the natural landscapes surrounding them for for our basic starches rather than oftentimes herbicide ridden conventional annual crop landscapes like those that produce corn and wheat and so on. And in all honesty, it doesn't seem that hard to me. I can easily produce flour from oaks with just like some water and a mason jar. So I'm sure with our great human technological ingenuity, we can make some machines where you can dump some acorns in on one side and have delicious pure acorn flour come out the other end. And acorn flour is not only ecologically beneficial, but it's also it's really it's more nutritious than some of those annual grains. It can be very healthy, and it also makes a delicious admixture with them. So I've made like acorn waffles and muffins and so on. And it's very nutritive. And I'd just like to imagine what it would be like if we, I think, returned to more of an oak-based culture rather than a wheat and corn and soy-based culture. So we talked about things that briefly, things we could do that would be beneficial to streams and riversides and so on. What can we do for ridges and glades and slopes and hilltops and these areas of exposed granite with little bonsai trees growing out of the cracks and all these cool ericaceous shrubs like your huckleberries and your low bush blueberries and your interesting low native grasses and sedges and wildflowers that also thrive in these arid landscapes. And I'd say that one of the things that's unique about these habitats, and one of the reasons why they can be so bountiful in fruits and nuts, is because um, there's a lot of sunlight reaching the ground layer and reaching the shrub layer. So they are a place where different native cherries or aronias or service berries or so on can really thrive because they don't have that closed canopy above them, because the rock physically prevents that by limiting the locations where trees can grow to a more widely spaced configuration. But of course, these habitats can also grow in. They can either tree in over time with leaf litter and soil development, or sometimes they can be dominated by just one of these heathy ericaceous shrubs, or one or two, at the expense of some of the wildflower and grass and sedge diversity that you might find up in those places. So one of the things that we can do that would be beneficial maintenance in these places is simply to keep them open. And we can do that by methods of harvesting that expose a little bit of soil for fresh germination. We can do that by coppicing, by physically cutting down trees and shrubs and allowing them to resprout in such a way that more sun reaches all their neighbors. We can use those coppice stems for basketry, craft of different kind, and so on. We can practice selective thinning, and also, of course, we can use fire. So, fire, one of those signature land management tools of Indigenous peoples, is not only of benefit to us in making these landscapes sort of more readily harvestable, um, but it also reduces oak diseases and reduces the pest load of acorn eating weevils. So, oftentimes when you go and forage acorns, some of them will be bad because they have weevils in them. If fire on the landscape actually kills back all those acorns that are left on the ground that are inhabited by weevils, it reduces uh, it reduces the weevil load on acorns on oaks the following year. And so I think of fire as a reciprocal benefit. It improves harvesting. It helps those beautiful open grown oaks persist with less competition from other tree species, and it also helps them to be more healthy. And so the introduction of fire not only has an ecological benefit for the plant community and plant diversity at large, but also directly for the species that we might be in cultural partnership with, providing food. So, uh, I'm going to leave you with some before and after pictures from a restoration project that I did on a farm. They had had one of these conifer plantations on marginal land, and it had been blown down during Superstorm Sandy, and they were growing organic vegetables and so on, and they were interested in a native landscape that would feature some food plants. And so These are some early photos from there. I have to say that unfortunately, um, the farm was sold, and I haven't been able to go back and see if that landscape is still there and how it turned out. And this, I guess, is one of the things that happen to those of us that do restoration on private land is sometimes it changes hands, and then you never know what happened to your restoration. But leave you with these pretty pictures, including hummingbird down there, and some elderberry. And one last anecdote. So I have a colleague. We were doing some film work together in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And one of the things we have in common, and the subject of most of our conversation when we're driving to and fro and doing film work, is conservation and nature and the environment. That's mainly what we share. Except I think we have very different approaches. So, um, my friend, he tends to, read the news a lot, and he loves to talk about all the like horrific environmental news. And I kind of have a like, I can't deal. I see enough bad news just walking out my front door and walking into the woods. I really don't need to know like the latest uh, minute to minute updates on species extinctions worldwide. And so he's kind of like hammering into me with like scientists believe that I don't know, some outrageous number, 50% of all of Earth's species will disappear in the next 50 years or whatever. Don't quote me on that. I wasn't actually listening. And the point of all this is eventually, I was sort of fed up and I just rolled down my window and I was like, so we're leaving the Pine Barrens and we're kind of like in suburbs with little woodlots. I just point out the window at one of the woodlots and I was like, hey, look at that woodlot over there. Like that probably already lost 50 to 70% of its species. And do you think any of the people living around it, do you think they know? Do you think they noticed? Do you think they care? Do you think that like just dumping doomy facts on people is going to suddenly make them care? And I thought, like what really makes us care is if we have some kind of connection, if we have an attachment. We're not going to care about the woodlot losing 50, 70% of its species if we don't even know what was in there in the first place, right? It's non-perceptible to us. And similarly, I'm not sure that we're going to care that the earth is losing, some horrendous percentage of its wild species because we have no direct relationship to them. And I believe that we need a reason to care. We need to overcome this great forgetting about all of the other beings that inhabit the world around us. And we need to remember that we're wildlife also. We need to find our habitat again. We need to connect with plants in ancestral ways. As there's a saying like the way to a person's stomach or man's stomach is, no, sorry, through their heart, it's through their stomach. Um, yeah, one of the ways to our hearts is through our stomachs. One of our ancestral interrelationships with plants is as food and as medicine, and also for craft and ceremony. And if we're going to overcome this great forgetting about plants and other wild creatures, we need to reconnect. And one of the ways that we can reconnect is through cultural plant species. I think that in sundering ourselves from the natural world, we've done ourselves a disservice, but not just ourselves, the rest of the natural world as well. The earth needs us to do more than take only photographs and leave only footprints. We need connection and we need reciprocal exchange. Thank you very much. Um, Thanks for sticking with me. If you enjoyed this presentation, there's a whole book that talks about these ideas called Wild Plant Culture. You can find it at wildridgeplants.com, which is our native plant nursery, or wherever you like. I mean, honestly, if you go to your local library and ask them to stock the book, that would be just wonderful. Um, if you like to talk about plants, feel free to get in touch. I like talking about plants. So there's my email and Instagram and so on. And I would be really happy to answer any questions that have come up for people in the course of this talk. I'm going to unscreen share here.
Thank you so much, Jared. That was,
Thank you.
thank you very much. Um, Everyone, please, there's not a lot of questions populating our chat. If anyone has any questions, please pop them in, and Fabulous Chris will uh, moderate our questions for a minute here. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Happy holidays from all of our Wild Ones people. If you are a Wild Ones, thanks for being one. If you're not, you thanks for joining us anyway.
All right, so like Tamara said, if anybody has questions, I do have the ability enabled. If you want to unmute yourself and ask Jared the question yourself, you're more than welcome to do that. We do have one question in the chat from Patty Flowers, who says, how do you personally deal with the grief when people don't care?
I think I think I've kind of shut down. That's my honest answer. Um, I think that I have a lot of grief when I go into natural areas and I sort of have a sense of what could be there or how rich and beautiful they could be. And I think sometimes I find myself not caring too, just as like a mechanism of sort of like psychological self-preservation. And so I think I can relate to why people don't care. I mean, on the one hand, I can relate as a city kid who I didn't have a nature connection growing up. You know, maybe I could tell the difference between a maple and an oak, but that was probably it. And so I think about different ways to help people care that are fun or exciting or speak to something like fundamentally human about us, but I can also relate to why we shut down. And one of the things that I think about is the degree to which I think we traumatize young people with all of the ecological woes and global collapse that they're sort of inheriting at really young ages. And I wonder if at least if they saw like the fun and adventure and beauty and maybe even tasty food in the natural world at the same time as all of that bad news, it would help balance it to some degree because there is still so much like wonder and beauty out there. And I have to say, as like the parent of a teen who doesn't always find it interesting to go on like long botany hikes with me, can't imagine why. Um, if I'm like, hey, it's blueberry season, we're going top of a mountain, we're going to eat blueberries all afternoon, like he's out the door faster than I am. So, and maybe I've lost a trace of your initial question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I have a lot of sympathy for people who don't care, either from ignorance or because they've sort of shut down because of how traumatizing all the information about the natural world is. And I really think that for every little dose of horrible information that we give people about the environment, it's really our responsibility to communicate a lot of like good, positive, exciting, fun, interesting information. And that may mean different things to different people. It's not always going to be like, this is how many warblers I saw this morning, or like, this is how many butterflies I photographed. And I notice that when I give like hikes or walks about native edibles or permaculture and stuff like that, I get a very different audience than I get if I do like a wildflower walk or a botany walk or something. You know, people from different age groups and different cultural backgrounds and so on that might not be there for the botany walk are suddenly interested in foraging and edibles and so on.
So another kind of question, I'm going to combine it with a question that I wrote down while you were talking. Um, Kind of overlaying with that, what is the best way to kind of maybe open people up to these relationships, or what are good gateways to get people interested in these sort of things without maybe causing more problems? So if I take somebody on a chanterelle hike or something like that, or if I take somebody to a golden seal patch or a wild leek patch or something like that, there's a chance that they could come in and decimate these areas rather than steward these spaces or have that kind of braiding sweetgrass type moment where we reinsert ourselves back into the ecological system. Do you have any tips, tricks, or anecdotal things where you could say, how do we get people to care again or reinsert themselves?
Yeah. And that's a really good question. I think that we all live with the fear that um, we're going to show people a really nice natural area and then they're going to utilize it in some way that is, not to our liking or is detrimental. And I think that you know, I don't have a great answer to that, but my only answer is to circle back to the idea of stewardship and how important it is to introduce ideas around tending and caretaking at the same time as we introduce ideas around whatever it is, foraging or mountain biking or rock climbing or whatever. And that, like, as restoration and stewardship become more part of our common cultural language again, I think that we'll be better able to integrate those in at the ground level when somebody becomes interested in, chanterelles or native medicinal plants or what have you as sort of part of the ethos. I guess what I'm saying is that ultimately, so much of conservation, even though we often talk in scientific terms, is really about culture. It's about building culture. It's about building culture that's, I think, creative and welcoming, and also building culture where stewardship is one of its fundamentals.
So another question, kind of entry level, or not entry level per se, but what would you recommend someone does to first start introducing plant communities into a new space?
For me, one of the really cool things about getting into wild plants and native plant gardening is, as I said, like I was a city kid, I didn't have a connection to place in a natural sense. I mean, don't get me wrong, I really loved growing up in New York City and I did have a strong connection to the urban place. But I think of planting or restoring like our first areas as this window to learn so much more. Um, it's sort of, on the one hand, I think that there's a craving in our culture to have simple answers. And I think simple answers can be really important and effective. So people will ask me, they're like, what's a great native ground cover? And I'm like, well, there isn't really like an English ivy or a pachysandra, but you can, look at the place and look at the shade and maybe introduce these diverse species. And in a way, I wish, maybe there was just like a native, English ivy or whatever. But the benefit of this is that our gardens and our native plantings become a window into this wider world that I think we could all uh, feel more rooted in, that we could all feel more emplaced in. And so, as you're going about considering those first plantings, it's an opportunity, I think, to think about um, how much sun and shade in there is there? Let me put my hands into this soil and dig deep someplace where maybe I've never put a shovel into the ground and learn a little bit about, is this clayey or sandy or loamy? Does it, and it doesn't have to be super sophisticated. It's like, is this really dark? It probably has a lot of organic matter, it has a lot of carbon in it. Is it really light? Maybe it's excessively drained or poor in nutrients, or is just simply lacking in organic matter deposition over time. And so each of these things kind of gives us a little bit more window of a story of our place. And as we get deeper into the story of our place, I like to think that we develop more of an attachment to that place and more of ability to communicate about it to others. So when we're putting together our native plant palettes, it's opportunity to think like, what plants would really thrive here? And oftentimes that leads to questions about things like moisture levels or soil types or shade or geology and so on.
I'm going to ask one more question that wasn't on that kind of continues that conversation, where we've talked a lot about, or you've talked a lot about, the plant selecting, observing the natural environment, going into these reference spaces as, something that we could try to recreate or steward or mimic. But it gets a bit overwhelming for as somebody who I also do this for a living, approaching clients or people in the community or people that are trying to start this process. Do you have any gateway kind of things or reference materials? Your book, is very inspiring to get people to care about these spaces, but then it's kind of like, well, now what? where you could place black-eyed Susans, they may take over. You could plant Jupai weed, they may take over. But then you kind of do the 2.0 version where people are kind of a little bit in analysis paralysis. Do you have any anecdotal stories or things to say like, this is a good starting spot for somebody who maybe has a suburban lawn or a really destroyed environment like that tree farm
Yeah,
that you were talking about?
that's a really good question. Because many of us inhabit similar residential landscapes, right? There'll be lawns, there might be a shade tree or two, there might be some typical landscape plantings, and where do we start? And uh, one of the places that I really like people to consider starting is, well, I'm just gonna talk about a couple. Um, One is with native shrubs. There's such an incredible diversity of native shrubs, and there's some that we talk about as native plant gardeners all the time. And there's a lot that are sort of semi-forgotten, but they're also oftentimes really beautiful plants. And some of the things that I like about the shrubs is sometimes they come from genera that are really good at supporting lepidopterans. So there are a lot of different native prunus shrubs, for example. There's even like dwarf oaks. Um, Also, shrubs tend to be or can be like really bountiful in flower, especially like your spring flowering shrubs like your amelanchiers or your prunus species, your aronias, your rubises, all of them just like gorgeous flowers. Um, and then, to kind of like weave back to the same theme, many of them have really good edible fruits or nuts. So we've got American hazelnut and we've got beach plum. Um, we've got the service berries. And so you could start by planting a native shrub or two. Um, they're pretty plastic in their habitat requirements. Many of them will tolerate full sun, but also, a fair degree of shade. And not only have you put a native plant there, but you've put in probably food for butterflies or moths, quite possibly shelter for birds, a little bit of leaf litter deposition in what might have been a lawn before, and sometimes some privacy and stuff too. So, I think that there are a lot of forgotten native shrubs, and the last part of my pitch is I think a lot of them are disappearing from the landscape because they're being competed with by deer-resistant non-native species like your autumn olives and your multiflora roses and so on and so forth. And I don't often go into the wild landscape and see like our native euonymus, but I see a ton of burning bush. Um, and I don't often see like American plum, even though by all accounts this was a fairly common plant species. So, and then I see a lot of pinkster azalea, which is absolutely stinking gorgeous, but they're this tall because they're browsed by deer. I can't say how many botanical surveys I've reports have written where I said, like ankle high or shorter pinkster azalea because they're everywhere, little suckers of them, but they're all this tall. I mean, unless they're like hanging off the edge of a stream bank or something like that. Um, so those native shrubs, they need our help. They're always pretty much within deer browse height, or they need to regenerate themselves from shoots that are, and adopt a native shrub for starters.
Can I interrupt Chris for a second? Since we've just heard the word deer so many times, I know we weren't going to open this can, but could you just for a moment, our relationship with deer was very different.
Yeah, that's a great way to
Um,
start it. Yeah. Yeah, so like we think a lot about missing mountain lions or wolves or other large predators, but who was the most significant predator of deer for the last 10,000 years? That was us. And so it's not just that we remove those other predators, who can do the nasty work for us or whatever. It's that we removed ourselves as keystone wildlife in the landscape. And one of the services that we provided was keeping the deer population in balance with all the other wildlife and wild plant populations because deer don't do it themselves. They don't have contraception or whatever. I mean, we can't even do it ourselves. And we do have freaking contraception and some notion of what overpopulation does. So, deer have always and prey species in general, right? They've always relied on predators as an important component of keeping them in balance with the carrying capacity of the natural landscape around them. And when we walk away from that role for, I think, putatively ethical reasons about like not harming wildlife or that hunting is brutal or unethical or something, or that it would be best to be vegetarian or vegan, I understand why those are responses to like our horror at things like factory farming and so on, but they're not necessarily appropriate responses to the need of our local ecology for human beings to regulate the deer population. So, quite simply, we need to step back into our role as responsible regulators of the deer population because otherwise, the deer are way overpopulated. So many of the landscapes I was talking about earlier in the presentation that are emptied out because deer have eaten all the native plants out of them. So many invasive plants are there. Sorry, everybody, if this is old hat. Invasive plants are there simply because they're deer resistant and they're now occupying niches that were occupied by native plant species. And gosh, where was I even going? Just so many of our ecological problems are due to deer, and we see incredible recovery within deer exclosure fences. And we know that at some level, like hunting and population control does work, but it's very, very, very challenging within both a fraught ethical environment and also within a suburbanized landscape where sometimes access to meaningful hunting and being hunters as sort of like stewards of the land, there's just so much disconnect there right now. That's a great cheerful way to end off the night,
Thanks
right?
for that. Yeah,
Everybody's
sorry.
done.
Thanks
It's like,
for
all
the
right, we heard your deer spiel. We've heard it a million times. Thank you. Good night. So,
here. Well,
um,
here's our
yeah,
positive note is
yeah.
so because of your book, I completely changed my relationship with Monarda Didyama, and I now have tons because it is abundant around us. I'm close to Slippery Rock Creek, and
Oh, nice.
it's just it is it likes the areas around me. Um, And I use it all the time now in cooking. Like the leaves,
Yeah,
not just the
totally.
petals, but the leaves all the time. And I never even thought to go there until I had read your book. And I was like, why am I not using my native plants as herbs in my food? So,
That's totally awesome. Yeah, bee balm, it's like our native Mediterranean mint. It's like our oregano or our thyme or whatever. And same with wild bergamot. And they're great for food. Cool. Well, thanks for ending us on a positive note. Thanks for everybody for coming out. And Chris and Tamara, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the extra time answering all those questions too. I really appreciate your well descriptive answers.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody.
good night, everyone. Thank
Good
you
night.
for joining us, everyone. If you're still here, we do have another winter Zoom in January. It's Tuesday, January 20th, and it will be a panel discussion on how individuals and communities can improve natural landscaping policies. So check your emails and pay attention to social. We're not great on socials, but check your emails. Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays. That was a happy lot of people.